Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here again. Welcome back to the Gay Street Studios. Hope you are enjoying yourselves on whatever day you're watching today. I am filming on this nice, beautiful, cloudless sky Friday afternoon. A little nippy outside. Got down to either below freezing or right at freezing last night. It's one of those beautiful days when you have to really bundle up in the morning, but the day warms up as you go by. It's great sweater weather, my favorite kind of weather. Um, okay, well, we were talking about Hurston. This is Hurston day number 3. And we were talking about some of the remarkable elements of Hurston's accomplishment in this great book, Eyes Are With Their Eyes Are Watching God. Talking about several elements to notice, and we ended with with the idea that we didn't pursue in the text, which I want to do today, but we ended with the notion, the proposition that Hurston imbues the issue of race with a complexity that belies the monolithic properties we stereotypically ascribe to that social construction. And she demonstrates in many passages. We're going to concentrate on one today. I think the most compelling one today. She explores in many different passages the complexity of discourse that's present in African American culture, in this case, African American culture in the South. In other words, it is not a monochrome culture in terms of its opinion. It's a culture in which there inheres a social tension and a social plurality, and a social complexity that produces intramural discourse in a very sophisticated way. Um, and it also demonstrates that there are, as I said last time, there are hypocrisies, there are contradictions, there are self deceptions within Black culture, along with Black culture's beauty, its intelligence, its compassion. And Hurston, I ended with this notion last time that Hurston insists on exploring the complexity in which Black culture's humanity is in evidence, right? Pardon me. So she's not so much, grinding a political axe as she is insisting on the humanity of Black culture by giving evidence to its discursive complexity, its flaws, and its compelling qualities. So let's look at this this insistence on the plurality, the multivalence of perspective, the diversity of discourse that is present in this great book. And let's turn to it's my page. If you have this text, it's page 134, 135, 136. And if you have the other most common text, it's page 140. Okay, so 134/140. I'll give you a second to get there. Give me a second to get there. And this is Janie's conversation with Ms. Turner. You remember that? Do you see the paragraph beginning, but Ms. Turner's shape and features? But Ms. Turner's shape and features were entirely approved by Mrs. Turner. Her nose was slightly pointed, and she was proud. In other words, quote unquote, Caucasian physical features. Um, Her nose was slightly pointed and she was proud. Her thin lips were an ever delight to her eyes. Even her buttocks in bas relief were a source of pride. To her way of thinking, all these things set her aside from Negroes. That was why she sought out Janie to friend with. Janie's coffee and cream complexion and her luxurious hair made Mrs. Turner forgive her for wearing overalls like the other women who worked in the fields. She didn't forgive her for marrying a man as dark as tea cake, but she felt she could remedy that. That was what her brother was born for. She seldom stayed long, and when she found tea cake at home, she seldom stayed long when she found tea cake at home. But when she happened to drop in and catch Janie alone, she'd spend hours chatting away. Her disfavorite subject was Negroes. So you feel this tension emerging between a figure like Mrs. Turner, who has embraced, who has accepted the values of white supremacist culture and found a place for herself, found an identity for herself within white supremacist culture's social taxonomy, social categorization, versus Janie, who I don't even want to say defies this system of categorization. I think Hurston defies it in the writing of this great book. But the character Janie is very relaxed and very chill about her perspective upon these issues. This is not a character who makes strident political points. She's a character, she's a live and let live character, but Hurston demonstrates some of the, how should I put it, some of the problematic properties of African American culture in a critical way. I'm going to continue with that, but notice too, this is a great example of free indirect discourse, which we talked about last time, emerging. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just as an example, her nose was slightly pointed and proud. Her thin lips were an ever delight to her eyes. Now the phrase ever delight is a subjective phrase, right? It is it's a phrase that's taken directly from the vernacular, and it's a very beautiful phrase taken directly from the vernacular. You see, so it's a subjective vernacular phrase that Hurston is inserting into what otherwise would be a more reportorial description of Mrs. Turner. You see, and so this reportorial prose, this third person, more objective prose, this indirect discourse is freed, is liberated. You see. Also, she in this sentence, that was why she sought out Janie to friend with. Well, back in 1935, 1936, to friend, the word friend was not a verb. To friend with, that was a vernacular phrase, but it's a vernacular phrase that's very beautiful and suffuses the sentence with a kind of vernacular warmth, a kind of subjective emotional richness, right? And Hurston is brilliant at this. And it really gives that reportorial prose, that what otherwise would be a reportorial paragraph simply describing a character, a real subjective elan, a real life, right? A real vivid vigor. Very beautiful. Okay, but back to the subject of Hurston's exploration of African America's diverse discourse with respect to racial issues, and Hurston's explorations of what she clearly considers to be flaws and self-deceptions in that discourse. Ms. Woods, so here's Ms. Turner addressing Ms. Woods in the next paragraph. Ms. Woods, I have often said to my husband, I don't see how a lady like Miss Woods can stand all them common niggers round her place all the time. Okay, now you imagine Richard Wright hearing this in 1937 when it's published in New York, and you imagine W.B. Du Bois hearing this, Wright, the more political, you might even say more radical uh, 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 cultural figure, and W.B. Du Bois, the more quote unquote conservative figure who insists on that notion of the talented 10th. You can imagine both of those disparate figures reading this dialogue and thinking, here we have a writer representing what we consider to be uneducated speech patterns, speech patterns that don't showcase our articulateness, our intelligence. Then you see it from Hurston's point of view as an ethnologist, as an anthropologist, as a sociologist, a trained anthropologist. An anthropologist trained with one of the most important foundational anthropologists in the world who loved her, right? So she's seeing this discourse. She's seeing this dialogue. She's presenting this dialogue as evidence of the beautiful and multiplicitous dimensions of African American oral speech, right? Of the African American language, so to speak. I've so often said to my husband, I don't see how a lady like Miss Woods can stand all them common niggers around her place all the time. And that word, the N word, that resonates, doesn't it? And it resonates very negatively with W.B. Du Bois, very negatively with Richard Wright, for good reasons. But you also think of, and it's not unlike what Faulkner is doing in his early novels. First of all, it is an accurate representation of speech in this time and this place, right? And I hope you don't think I'm taking sides on this. I have a side, I suppose. I side with Zora Neale Hurston, but it's a very complex issue, and I don't mean to treat it I don't mean to be facile at all about it, and you can see good reasons why an African American cultural critic like W.B. Du Bois might object to this kind of language. You can also see, I would insist, that it belongs in a work like this by a writer like this, who is so clearly in love with the beauty of her culture and her culture's roots in the Deep South. Okay. Also, I just wanted to make this point too. The N-word, the use of the N-word. It also, as is often the case in Faulkner, in the later novels, particularly in the early novels to some degree, Sound and the Fury was on the early side, right? The use of the N-word here, it marks the characters that use it as negative types. When you see the N-word being used in Hurston, it's being used, it seems to me, quite intentionally by the author in a very sophisticated way, in the sense that, in this sense, this is the way people like this talk, as opposed to people like that. And you notice, and we'll come across the N-word several times today in the next few paragraphs, but you'll notice that Janie never picks up on that she never reciprocates the use of that word. You see? So there's an honest representation of actual dialect and actual lexical choices here, as represented by Ms. Hurst, by Zernial Hurston. And there's also, it seems to me, an understated but very clear sense of political judgment, social judgment, social evaluation. Janie doesn't use that word. Okay. I don't see how a lady like Ms. Woods can stand all them common niggers around her place all the time. They don't worry me at all, said Ms. Turner. So the tension begins, right? The dialogue, the dialect begins. Fact about the thing is, they tickles me when they talk. You got more nerve than me. When somebody talked my husband into coming down here to open up a eating place, I never dreamt so many different kinds of black folks could collect in one place. Did, I never would have come. So there's Hurston asserting the notion of African-American plurality, African-American social and cultural multiplicity, African-American plurivalence, in contrast to that monolithic, monochromatic stereotype. Yeah? And notice this is all intramural dialogue, intramural dialectic, so that the reader realizes there is complexity in this culture. And then by extension, there is discourse, there is humanity in this culture. There are flaws, as human beings are all flawed. There is the beautiful in them, as human beings are all beautiful. And you get the notion, I'm sure some of you have studied Bakhtin, you get that notion of the beautiful multiplicitous plurality of culture that you do in Bakhtin here. I ain't used to associating with black folks. You know, it's all very ironic because she herself is African American. You know, and you really do begin to see here in a discussion like this, in which one character takes this very firm, hard line supporting this highly racialized social hierarchy. You really do get a living sense, and I love this about Hurston, that race is a social construction. Race is a cultural construction. It does not exist genetically. You know, and notice. Hurston never hits you over the head with it, but you begin to see you begin to see the proposition enacted before you dramatically in this beautiful dialogue. Do you see? You're not being hit over the head with it sociologically. You're not being lectured to by the writer, right? She's constructing a drama in which you come to understand, in no uncertain terms, the political critique that she's making, as well as the social elements that she is celebrating and the psychological elements that she is celebrating in her people. Her people that is part of our people. Our human people, you see? And I think this is part of the beauty of Hurston. And I think it must be, I'm speculating here, but it's a part of the beauty that that later African-American writers, particularly African-American women writers, have found in Hurston, right? Okay, I ain't used to associating with black folks. My son claims they draws lightning. You know, clearly an ignorant statement, right? So you feel Hurston kind of loading the dice, sentence by sentence, line by line of dialogue against Ms. Turner. Yet she maintains that sense of dialectic, you know, that sense of conversation. They laughed a little, and after many of these tales, Miss Turner said, "Your husband must have had plenty money when y'all got married." What make you think that? Why would my husband had to have had a lot of money? To get hold of a woman like you. You got more nerve than me. I just couldn't see myself married to no black man. There's too many black folks already. We ought to lighten up the race. We ought to lighten up the race. In other words, you have Miss Turner here, not just, how should I put it, not just accepting, but actively promoting, actively enabling the social logic of the white supremacist South. We ought to lighten up the race. In other words, it's our responsibility as light-colored African Americans to keep this end of the race as light as it can possibly be, so that we can draw the race up, the dark race up, by our lightness. And the problematic logic of that asserts itself to the 21st century reader very clearly, as it must have in the 70s as well. Okay. No, he said, Janie replies, well, Ms. Turner, we ought to lighten up the race. No, my husband didn't have nothing but himself. He's easy to love if you mess around him. I loves him. It's wonderful dialogue. He's easy to love if you mess around him. If you hang out with him enough. Why you, Miss Woods? I don't believe it. You're just sort of hypnotized, that's all. No, it's real. I couldn't stand it if he was to quit me. I don't know what I'd do. You remember the reason Hurston is on this Guggenheim in the first place is to forget PMP, to kind of expunge his presence from her consciousness, to work her way past her quote unquote obsession. So there's the very much, it's one of the reasons I love the book. It's very sociological, isn't it? It's very political, isn't it? And it's also very personal. And all three are present. None dominating, it seems to me. Okay. If he was to quit me, I don't know what I'd do. He can take most any little thing and make summertime out of it when times is dull. Then we lives off of that happiness till he made some more happiness come along. Okay, so now look at that paragraph and look at the prose. Look at Hurston's representation of the dialogue. And here you have a skinny old bald white dude reading this highly this highly inflected dialogue that's represented in the actual typography, on the page. And you can understand, getting back to my previous point, you can understand Richard Wright's approach to this. You can understand Richard Wright's response. Why is Hurston representing our speech in this way that seems to be illiterate and that seems to be ignorant of basic vocabulary and basic grammatical expressions? Seems to be ignorant of the principles of standard English, which we African Americans have mastered, as evidence in Richard Wright's work, which is fantastic, and W.B. Du Bois's work, and Charles S. Johnson's work, and Elaine Locke's work, trying to connect us to day one, right? But then you also can understand Alice Walker's rationale, her response to this beautiful language. Here's a woman, she must have thought, in the early 70s, going down to Florida from Ms. Magazine and Gloria Steinem, she must have felt that She must have felt that this Zora Neale Hurston is a woman that understood the beauty of spoken speech, the beauty of vernacular, and most specifically, the poetic beauty of of African American speech rhythms, speech patterns, dialogue. And you guys, as students, I just want you to see, no matter what your racial background may be, I don't even use the word race anymore. It's just so problematic culturally, in that it doesn't exist. Yet it exists so profoundly politically in our time. We're really strung in this ridiculous tension. Reifying something that does not exist in our own language because it's necessary to talk about, because it's still one of the governing organizational principles, God help us, of our culture. You know, um, but you can see why it must have been so important to Alice Walker here as well. Okay, use different from me. I can't stand black niggers. There's the N word again. Right, so Hurston wants Ms. Turner using that word, and there's never any antiphonal response to it. Janie never picks it up. I can't stand black niggers. I don't blame the white folks for hating them because I can't stand them myself. Another thing, I hates to see folks like me and you mixed up with them. Us ought to class off. Us ought to class off. In other words, we who exhibit some of the facial features, some of the physical features, not just facial, but physical features of quote unquote the Caucasian race, whatever the hell that is. We ought to separate ourselves. What's ought to class off? We ought to separate ourselves, or we ought to be allowed to separate ourselves from that darker complexion, those more negroid features. Again, one hates to even use a word like negroid, which was, a speciously scientific designation. You see this acceptance of class hierarchy within Black culture, the acceptance of white supremacist logic, which of course enables social stratification. Now, we've talked about this word hegemony before. Here you have a great example of how hegemony operates in any given culture. In this case, it's a white supremacist hegemony in the Southern American states, operating on the African American subject that it pushes to its margins, right? Hegemony relies on the acceptance of its social logic by those it marginalizes to perpetuate itself. Let me just read that again. Hegemony relies on the acceptance of its social logic by those it marginalizes, or by elements of those it marginalizes, by elements of the subaltern to perpetuate itself. And patriarchy, regardless of race, patriarchy operates in a similar way. Patriarchy, in part, relies on the acceptance of its organizational principles, so to speak, its structural principles, its hierarchical principles, so to speak, by women, by a certain element of women who, in their acceptance of its principles, protect patriarchy, promote patriarchy, and proliferate patriarchy. And you can hear political voices like this all the time. All you have to do is turn on the radio, listen. All you have to do is listen to National Public Radio, and you hear these kinds of voices, don't you? That's very disturbing. But anyway, so it's a great example of the ways in which hegemony perpetuates itself. So Ms. Turner proposes us ought to class off. And here's Janie in reply. Us can't do it. We's a mingled people. Very beautiful. Us can't do it. We's a mingled people. And all of us got black kinfolks as well as yellow kinfolks. How come you so against black? Right? So Janie immediately responds with the proposition that African American culture is not monolithic. African American culture is not monochromatic, literally monochromatic. It's not, right? And we, as members of that culture, Ms. Turner, can't organize ourselves according to that principle because that principle doesn't apply to us. You know, it doesn't apply to us. It doesn't apply to us genetically. It doesn't apply to us biologically. It doesn't apply to us physically. It doesn't apply to us emotionally. It doesn't apply to us intellectually. So let's not pay it any mind. You see? And again, all this, I love this about Hurston. All this is intramural sociologically. It's discourse that occurs. It's a discourse that doesn't need white supremacist culture to come in and assert itself in any way. You see, it's a discourse that can and should take place intramurally. I love this. And of course, Hurston is learning these principles all the way through her life, going all the way back to her father, who's mayor of the first incorporated African-American town in the country, all the way through to Harlem in the 30s, during that time of, 1925, Elaine Locke, the New Negro, all the way through 1935, which we are, where we are here. She's writing this in Haiti, of course, but all of her work for the Roosevelt administration, for the WPA, and all of her schooling, all during that period, 1925 to 1935, where she's learning in Harlem the self-sufficiency artistically, the self-sufficiency economically, the self-sufficiency spiritually, the self-sufficiency politically of African-American culture. That's why this period in Harlem is so cool. And you have to study it if you're interested in 20th century American writing. I mean, it's just a crucially important period. And I think I mentioned our great African American scholars and Caribbean American scholars, I should say Afro Caribbean scholars. We have a great set of people to work with here. So keep your eyes on the course listings, because you really need to take from our great profs, our great African American studies profs. We can't do it. We's a mingled people. And all of us got black kinfolks as well as yellow kinfolks. How come you so against black? So you have this dialectic, on the one hand, the acceptance of social identity as conferred by white supremacist culture, and on the other hand, a refusal, a rejection of that social identity. Indeed, a rejection of that physical identity upon which the social identity is based, sadly, which is the way any racist culture operates anywhere. Right? And I love that you can feel the critical intelligence of Hurston at work here. But she's not lecturing us sociologically. She's enacting the sociology that produces this social dialogue, this cultural dialogue, this cultural dialectic. She's truly dramatizing the social and the political in such a way that we get a very powerful sense, it seems to me, of the depth and profundity of these issues. But notice, as a white reader, speaking for myself, and as those of you who would identify as white readers, we are forced to inhabit this culture, leave our own behind, and inhabit our culture, and inhabit this culture, rather than simply examine it sociologically. You see, We have to enter into it. The other way of putting that is we are given the opportunity to enter into it, I think, in a very generous way. It's one of the beautiful things about books, period, and about films, period. It's also why it's so crucially important for all of us who love films, who love books, who love art generally, to make sure that we source what goes into our consciousness as diversely as we can. And luckily, you're at a great university and a great department that has organized itself to do that that specific, to do that specific task for you, to aid you in your development in that way. I don't mean that. Yeah, we're aiding ourselves as well as teachers in doing that. Very powerful. Let me see what time, where we are here. Okay, y'all. How come you so against Black? It makes me tired. Always laughing. They laughs too much. They laughs too loud. Always singing old nigger song again. 3 times so far, right? Marking Miss Turner. Always cutting the monkey for the white folks. If it wasn't for so many Black folks, it wouldn't be no race problem. The comic absurdity. It's something that you laugh at. Boy, you read all of Native Son, Richard Wright's book, you don't crack a smile. It's a great book. It's a great book. And if you haven't read it, you should read it and take a class that offers it. It's a great book, but not a lot of grins happening in that book. Okay. So, there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? And Hurston is, we smile at the ironic absurdity of Miss Turner's comments. And that's instructive. That's instructive for the white reader. It's instructive for the African-American reader as well, right? We're not being lectured to, and we embrace. We're allowed to embrace, and we laugh, and we smile, and we catch the ironies without being hit over the head by them, right? And there's beauty in the dialogue, there's beauty in the dialogue, and it's a beauty that doesn't exist in the lecture. That's why we meet each other in a classroom, by the way, because there's beauty in the dialogue, there's beauty in the discourse. And when you're in a classroom, a live, vivid classroom, and not another damn Zoom class with that skinny old bald bastard McKelly, but an actual live class, people who have not considered certain sides of issues hear the dialogue, and it's in the dialogue that they can begin to construct for themselves a new voice, that they can begin to find in themselves a new voice. Simply in keeping their ears open and keeping their hearts open, keeping their minds open. It's a beautiful thing, the classroom. It's a holy thing for me, the classroom. I know it's a holy thing for some of you as well. You begin to imagine your own role in it. Okay. You reckon? Of course, I ain't never thought about it too much, but I don't figure they even going to want us for company. We's too white people. You're going to want us for company. We's too poor. Huh. So Janie says, white people aren't going to want us to be hanging around with them. We're too poor. Now you see what's happening there. She's asserting another principle of social stratification that Ms. Turner has not alluded to, that she is, I don't want to say ignorant of, but that is not part of her socioeconomic landscape. It's not part of her socioeconomic critique. The principle of income, class, in other words, over race. And Janie's asserting it. Hurston, through Janie, is asserting it in a very nuanced way. You have to remember, Hurston's writing this in 1936, right? Published in 1937. You have the WPA, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's WPA, the Works Progress Administration, starting in 1935. You remember, and Hurston participates in the Federal Writers Project, the FWP, one of the amazing programs for artists of all types, or one of the initiatives, part of the Roosevelt administration's way of raising the country up after the horrific devastation wrought by the stock market crash. We've really had a couple of whammies, didn't we? The one coming off of the Bush administration, 1906, 1907, coming to a head in 1908, just as Obama takes control. And then now with COVID, wow. And we have the Biden administration attempting to help people through it in a human way, and help the economy through it in a long-term way, in a way that begins to mitigate some of the class stratification that we've been building up in this country, gosh, since 1980. Okay. We's too poor. And then Ms. Turner says, tain't the poorness, it's the color and the features. So you see how that translates sociologically. Look, I bring to bear a class analysis on social stratification in America. You're only seeing race as the primary factor in class stratification. Interesting now where we are in our culture, because we can see it's clearly a combination of both, right? And here you have a work in 1935 that's insisting that we consider that, and that African American culture consider intramurally, without the intrusion of old bald white dudes like me in it, consider the relation between race and class, and how to approach that that multiplicitous, right? That plurivalent, complex stratification, how to approach it politically, how to approach it socially. You listen to somebody like Stacey Abrams, the great former congressperson and political leader in Georgia. She's somebody that understands this profoundly. She's a writer too, Abrams is. Read Heather McGhee. Her recent work, just an incredible piece of work. Somebody else, another African American woman, it happens, that gets this. Tain't the poorness, it's the color and the features. Who want any little old black baby lying up in the baby buggy looking like a fly in the buttermilk? Okay, so I'm not going to continue. I'm not going to read all this. Let me skip 4 or 5 lines. Don't bring me no nigger doctor. You see that? There's that word nigger again, the N word, associated with doctors by Miss Turner. Don't bring me no nigger doctor to hang over my sick bed. So the implication, racialized self-hate intramurally, right? Don't bring me no nigger doctor to hang over my sick bed. I done had 6 children. Wasn't lucky enough to raise but that one. What happened to the other ones? And ain't never had a nigger to even feel my pulse. White doctors always gets my money. Then, of course, just below the surface, she's insisting on white doctors for her money, but she's lost 5 of her 6 children. And the implication is perhaps it's because those white doctors aren't doing you as well as you think that they're doing you. And perhaps you should consider an African American doctor. You see, but we're not lectured to. It emerges in the dialogue, and it's it's very clear. It's just below this. The ironies, pardon me, the ironies, the flaws, right? The self-deceptions represented perceived intramurally, represented intramurally without the intrusion of white supremacist culture on the outside, even liberal white culture, without the intrusion even of liberal progressive white culture, people like me, right? Hurston asserting the legitimacy of the intramural discourse regarding issues of race and class in and by and for African American culture. Excuse me. I'm going to check time. Okay. Skipping Ms. Turner insists again, they ought to make us class to ourselves. And again, Janie replies, it don't worry me at all, but I reckon I ain't got no real head for thinking. So she's kind of, pardon me, she's kind of backing down, she's backing down a little bit. She doesn't want to get into a knockdown drag out with Ms. Turner, except what Ms. Turner is proposing, it emerges is offensive to Janie. And she doesn't understand it. She doesn't understand Janie's perspective. And then they go on, and I wanted just to get us to this little conversation. Ms. Turner brings up her brother, right, who critiques Booker T. Washington. Okay, now, you guys who've studied African American history know, but those of you, so you guys, I'm sorry, bear with us. And you folks, students who are African American know this history. So, forgive us catching up with you here. But Booker T. Washington, he was an very important figure in African American history, as you know, as most of you know, and he was hugely important to Tuskegee Institute, right? As was George Washington Carver. But Booker T. Washington upheld the dignity of physical labor and practical trades and their value to Black progress. Let me just give that to you again if you just jot it down. And you can get this off Wikipedia easy enough, but just for those of you who haven't encountered Booker T. Washington before, upheld the dignity of physical labor and practical trades and their value to Black progress. Now, on the other hand, remember we've talked about Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, who talked about the Talented Tenth, and that there was something very sort of brain-oriented about his approach, and you could see it from a certain point of view. I'm not making this judgment, but I'm just putting it out there. From a certain point of view, you can see that insistence on the responsibility of quote unquote the talented 10th as utterly elitist, right? And very interesting. See, you have Hurston here herself contemplating these issues in 1935, 1936, influenced profoundly by Alain Locke, who was very intimately connected intellectually to and as friends to Charles S. Johnson and W.B. Du Bois, right? Crisis, Opportunity, The New Negro, all sort of talented 10th productions. But then she also, being from her background, knowing what she's from, knowing the wisdom and the beauty of the culture that she's from in the Deep South, is asserting that there's another way to see this, right? And perhaps an admixture of these different perspectives is the way to go. Okay, so Janie, do you see Miss Turner saying, you ought to meet my brother? You ought to meet my brother. He's real smart, got dead straight hair. Now you laugh at that because it's so ironic. And also there's a certain level of intramural prejudice there. Again, sort of back, associating intelligence, associating intelligence with the physical attributes of white people, In other words, the straighter your hair is, the smarter you can be. Patently absurd, and we laugh at it. But the irony and the social critique is very lucid. And for my money, it's made stronger because of our laughter, not weaker. Stronger. It holds us more. It opens our hearts to the critique more richly, the laughter. Right? Now, Richard Wright does it too. Does it very dramatically. I won't spoil the book for you. Does it very dramatically, but in a very different way. In a way that's very compelling. I mean, you got to read them both, right? Um, Booker T, he was a great big man, wasn't he? Supposed to be. All he ever done was cut the monkey for white folks, so they pumped him up. But you know what the old folks say, the higher the monkey climbs, the more he show his behind. So that's the way it was with Booker T. My brother hit him every time they give him a chance to speak. I was raised on the notion he was a great big man, was all Janie knew how to say. He didn't do nothing but hold us back, talking about work when the race ain't never ever when the race ain't never done anything but. I'm sorry, let me get that again. He didn't do nothing but hold us back, talking about work when the race ain't never done nothing else. He was an enemy to us, that's what. He was a white folks nigger. So Hurston's already loaded the dice in many ways against Ms. Turner here, right? We know that Hurston disapproves of the ideas, the offensive ideas that are being leveled by Ms. Turner, uh, and it's very powerful, isn't it? Because when we hear these ironies, when we chuckle, that ironic, that sort of iron, that kind of wry laugh that you chuckle when someone says something that's deeply ironic and that they don't quite get it, they don't understand why what they've said is so ironic. Your minds are opened, your brains are opened to the opposite idea, which is the idea that in fact, in this case, yes, Du Bois, Johnson, Elaine Locke, representing something very important, but Booker T. Washington also representing something very important, something indigenous, something Southern, something involving the body and not just the mind, something involving real labor and the dignity that resides in real labor and the role that real labor can have in rising in raising people out of poverty. Now that is not, I'm not preaching that is the way. I hope everybody understands that. That ain't mine. That's not the McKelly message. But it seems to me that what Hurston is doing in her insistence on this intramural, intra-racial dialogue, right? This kind of racially independent discourse is proposing that different perspectives are needed, different angles, different approaches are necessary, and we have to open our hearts and our minds to all of them. And guys, this one reason this book is so beautiful, I think Alice Walker must have seen this. Hurston is almost uniquely qualified. Think of the jump that she made from the manner of her childhood, the way she was brought through childhood, the things that happened to her, the hoops that she had to jump through, the difficulties that she had to power through by dint of sheer intelligence, sheer will, sheer strength, and then bringing to bear that will, that intelligence, that strength, and to a very different cultural sphere, Columbia University, Barnard, the leading lights of the Harlem Renaissance. Very, very powerful work from a unique personality. Okay. Sorry, guys, just bear with me here. Having trouble with my screen share. Let me just see if I can get this done. Sorry, y'all. I know this is annoying. Let's see if we can do it. Here we go. Okay. So this is Coleman Hawkins, tenor saxophone player. And we're going to hear his great song, Body and Soul. I'm going to jump into his story here. You know, I'm reading from our normal, need to give it props, from our great book, Jazz, by Jeffrey Ward and Ken Burns. Kind of a companion work to Ken Burns' great documentary. God, what is it, 8, 9, 10 parts? I forget what it was, but simply called Jazz. You can see it on PBS. A few months later, Hawkins went into the studio with a 9-piece group and recorded 4 sides, including Body and Soul, a ballad he had been playing for some years as, quote, an encore, he said, just, quote, something to get off stage with, unquote. Like Louis Armstrong's West End Blues 11 years earlier, remember that one, Coleman Hawkins' Body and Soul shook the musical world. It was in 3 parts. So keep your ears open for these. A tender elliptical 2-bar hint of the melody, 2 surging choruses that build to a thrilling crescendo, a gorgeous falling unaccompanied cadenza. Okay. So 2-bar melody, then chorus, central choruses, and then final falling cadenza. Except for a brief piano introduction and some gentle supportive chords from the rest of the band, it was all Hawkins' huge, warm, all-encompassing sound. Body and Soul sold astonishingly well for a disc by a jazz soloist, in which melody played such an insignificant part. Hawkins claimed not to be surprised. "Gracious," he said, "I play like that all the time." He had approached Body and Soul the same way he approached every ballad. He assured the young singer Thelma Carpenter. This is Hawkins talking, quote, "First, you have to tell them the story," by which he meant state the melody. "Then, it's like making love. You must romance her." The climax of the solo is, quote, this is Hawkins, I'm not making this up. The climax of the solo is, quote, "when you're having the orgasm," he said. And the cadenza, well, now that's the satisfaction. So Hawkins saw this as an utterly sexual song, sexual in its structure, right? Sexual in its structure. And you remember how we talked about Gertrude Stein refusing to inhabit the masculinist structures that governed typical narrative arcs. Remember? And we talked about how she is asserting a kind of a creature feminine that is a defiance of those masculinist narrative structures and characterological structures. and descriptive structures, attempting to find a woman's writing. Body and soul. I think Coleman Hawkins is is speaking for both speaking for both genders there. But the masculine is an important part of his masculine sexuality, not to put too fine a point on it, is an important part of the of understanding the organizational structure of this piece. But musicians heard much more than eroticism in Body and Soul. Hawkins' startling improvisation would help inspire a whole generation of young musicians to become what one saxophonist called, quote unquote, chord conscious, to see if they could take jazz in a different direction. So Coleman Hawkins, Body and Soul. Hey.